How can you get that larger-than-life techno bass sound that you've heard on countless productions on labels like Afterlife? These bass sounds are insanely well produced. They are super wide, but still work perfectly in mono without any phase issues whatsoever. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you the simple step-by-step process to creating super wide bass sounds in Ableton Live. First of all, let me show you what most producers do to create wide bass sounds and why this doesn't work and never lives up to the expectation of a professional release on a label like Afterlife. So I've created a custom synth bass patch inside Ableton Live's Drift synthesizer, and I've programmed MIDI notes that more or less resemble the style of a typical Afterlife release. So this is what this sounds like. So this is a very rhythmic pattern, and in case you're wondering why these MIDI notes don't seem to line up perfectly, this is because I'm using a couple of triplets here. If you bring this to the triplet grid, which you can also switch to by pressing Ctrl 3, you will see that stuff lines up perfectly on these lines. This is where I'm using triplets. So triplets are just a way to create very interesting grooves that aren't super straight. And it's always nice to have a mixture between triplet grooves and straight notes if you want to make this type of techno. Now the bass patch itself is quite simple. I'm using a sawtooth wave, and an octave down I'm using this shark fin style wave together with the sawtooth again. There's not much going on, a little bit of filter envelope here and a slight LFO going to the detune of the second oscillator just to create a little bit of movement in that patch. This is a mono patch right now. Now what a lot of producers do to create stereo bass sounds and why this doesn't work is they try to solve the problem with adding tons of unison. So most producers will do something like this. They change the mode to unison and add more and more unison to spread the synthesizer out to the sides. Now you get that wide kind of phasing sound on the side, and it, yes, sounds impressive on the first listen. But then the problem occurs when they try to make it bigger and bigger and bigger and then solve the problem by flipping the bass to mono. So what would be the logical next step? We go to the utility plugin, the next thing in the chain, and we increase the width here. So it sounds even wider. And then they try to solve the problem by flipping the bass in mono here. So everything below 120 Hz is now summed to mono. But the problem is that this doesn't really solve the underlying issue. Now, if you're using unison and you're spreading the synth out to the sides, and then you use the utility and make it even wider, the issue is not being solved by summing the bass to mono later on. Because the only thing that happens is that the waveforms that are already spread out and phasing against each other are then collapsed to mono. And most likely this will result to phase issues. So there's no solution happening here. The waveforms on the left and on the right channel are not magically being aligned in mono so that they don't cancel out. This is not happening with this tool. Now, an easy way to test the phase relationship between your left and right channels is to use the Flux Stereo tool. So this is a free plugin that you can use to test the phase relationship of the left channel and the right channel. So I'm going to play this now and explain what this all means. So here you can see a relatively straight line because I've not gone all in on unison and spread it out too wide. So this is still kind of in the ballpark. If the line more or less goes from top to bottom, then it means it's mostly mono compatible and not completely phasing against each other. If I now flip one channel, for example, the right channel, you will see the opposite. We'll see a line going from here to here. This basically just means that the left and the right channel are canceling out for the most part. An important thing to read here is also down below. This is, once again, the phase relationship. If this here, this little button, is between the 0 and the +1, it means that the phase relationship technically is okay because it's a positive relationship. If it goes more into the -1 direction, then the channels start to cancel out. So I'm going to show this by increasing the width even more. You can do it in the plugin or you can do it in the utility. It doesn't really matter. Now, I've overdone this on purpose so that you hear what happens when channels are actually canceling out. So our basic way of doing this, like I dialed it in right here, this would be the edge of being acceptable, but honestly, in large club systems that need to produce super powerful bass, I personally would still say that this is on the edge of not being okay. This bass does not sound super powerful to me. So what's the real secret to getting super white bass sounds that work perfectly in mono, that have no phase issues whatsoever, and that reproduce powerful bass on large club and festival systems? Make sure to pay close attention now and watch the video till the end, because I'm going to show you the step-by-step process now. But before we get there, if you struggle with finishing songs, and I know that most of you watching this do, then I have a free gift for you. It's called the Finisher Framework. It's my 3 simple steps that you can use to finish at least one great sounding song per month. So if that sounds intriguing to you, if you want to find out more, go to pickyourself.com/framework. This is entirely for free. You find the link in the description below this video. Alright, so step 1 is to just get rid of the utility, get rid of Unison and put this into mono again. And make sure that this is really sounding super stable to begin with. No phase issues, everything super centered, that's good. We're now going to create 2 different layers. A top layer and a sub layer. And so the secret here is to give each bass layer its own purpose and its own space in the stereo spectrum. Let's start with the sub bass. We have copied the settings completely from the mid bass, so we're just going to use the sub right now. And what I want you to do is to focus on creating a waveform that is extremely stable, that has not a lot of overtones. So this is why I will get rid of the sawtooth wave and go for a triangle. Triangles just have like a tiny bit of overtones. And maybe together with a sine wave, that is the deeper one. Now you hear these click sounds. This is because there's still like a lot of filter being shaped by the envelope. So I will just get rid of that. And we'll use a little bit of attack. We'll open up the filter exactly in the way that we want. This would be the maximum of overtones. Now in these super fast notes, it gets a little bit tricky, of course. So this is why you have to use a little bit more release. Until it sounds smooth, so that's the only goal. You want that sub bass to be super smooth and to not have any click sounds and basically play well with the rest together. That works perfectly. I'm super happy with that. What we can now do is we can try to make the sub bass even more stable. And this is by using a couple of mixing tricks. We can make the sub bass even more clean and more powerful by using a little bit of EQ afterwards and dial in exactly what we want. So I'm going to use the EQ8. The EQ8 is perfect because we can dial in exactly what we want. We will see it on the spectrum analyzer as well. You want to cut some of the super low end if necessary. So in my experience, it's often not necessary. So this is not super excessive. I would for now keep this in and only remove it if there's like a problem. And then the only thing you need is basically a second filter for the top band. And this is where you want to dial in a little bit of resonance. You want to find that sweet spot where a lot of that fundamental notes are coming through. So you might not even hear this on some headphones or some speakers. But this is kind of the sweet spot. I'm dialing in exactly that resonance that I want to emphasize in the fundamental notes of that bass patch. Next up, we use a limiter. And this is contrary to common belief. A lot of people think that you can't use something like a limiter on sub bass. It's absolutely not true. I will use the Ableton limiter. It's still not my favorite one, but a lot of people just have the stock plugins, so I'm going to do it anyway. I never use this auto setting. It just doesn't make sense. I use a relatively quick release time, 30-40 milliseconds. And I only want a tiny bit of limiter action going on here. This is just to make this as stable as possible, basically. You could also just go into the MIDI notes and make sure that the velocity is the same on all these MIDI notes. That would be also a really good option. So this Ableton limiter still introduces a tiny bit of distortion. If you use something like the FabFilter Pro L2, this will be definitely much cleaner. So our sub layer is in place. What do you now do with the other 2 layers? We're going to use our bass mid layer, and we're actually going to allow ourselves to make this a tiny bit broader. So you're going from sub to mid to top end. So the top layer will be the broadest one. We'll give this the role of starting in the low mids or upper bass region. not including the subs, and allowing it to be like a little bit wider. So you go into the unison, but only dial in like a little bit of that. And then you can dial in the sweet spot of where the crossover happens. So you can use the EQ8, use a low cut filter here, and try to not make this get in the way of the sub and the other way around. We'll just find the sweet spot here by actually listening to it together with the sub. Sounds super nice. We'll use the sub here. As you can see, the sub is well below 100 Hertz, and here has its peak right at slightly below 100 Hertz. So this is why they're not getting in the way of each other. I think they're doing a nice job of playing together. You can, if you want to, reduce the top end here a little bit to give the bass top its own kind of way of opening up, but sometimes it sounds cool to have both of them engaged. So I will for now keep this in and maybe adjust it later. Let's go to our bass top now. The thing that you want to create with the bass top is you want to have like a little bit of that attacky, clicky sound that actually defines the transient of the bass, and you want this to spread it out even more, because this is where you can go crazy with stereo spread, because in the top end the phase relationship really doesn't matter because the waveforms are so short that actually doesn't make any difference for a club system to reproduce this in mono. The top bass really is the secret sauce here, and I'm sure you'll be surprised as to why that is. Now, if you got any value out of this video so far, then consider subscribing to the channel, consider liking this video. It really helps me help you better, and it also helps you because the algorithm will suggest more good videos for you. So why are we using a wavetable synth as our bass top layer? The reason is simple. I want to create a different series of overtones that are basically ear candy to the listener, that make them feel like the bass is super close to them and it's surrounding them everywhere. And this is how this whole huge bass sound comes together. So the types of wavetables you want to choose is the ones that have a lot of overtones. So for example, you can go to the harmonics bank and use something like this transistor saw, sounds like this. So right now it's obviously not dialed in perfectly. And for the second oscillator, we can, for example, use the swept noise, which once again gives us a little bit of that metallic feel. Sounds super digital and nasty right now, but bear with me, this is going to sound amazing in a second. Let's first of all bring this down and listen to it in context. And select some unison here. I like the shimmer quite a lot, but you can play around with different ones. Precision spread sometimes sounds nice, phase sync as well. The shimmer is my preferred one for this type of application. Now you have to play around a little bit to get the perfect setting. And also dial in an amp setting, like the envelope, to make sure that this is actually snappy, not ringing out forever. Now you can do what Wavetable is meant to do, and that is using LFOs, for example, or envelopes to actually sweep a little bit across those wavetables. Super easy. You go to the modulation matrix and you map either the LFOs or the envelopes or both to the position of these wavetables. So wavetable 1 position is this one here. Let's map an LFO to this. And let's, for example, use the second LFO and map it to the other position. We then also map an envelope, this could be the main envelope or another envelope, to our filter cutoff frequency. So just to make sure that this gets a little bit more snappy, let's try this with the amp envelope and see how it works. You can dial in some of the other filters as well if you like a little bit of distortion. I really like this OSR filter. So So the main goal is just to get a little bit of grit in here. You can also use a little bit of a saturator after that. So you're doing this just to get that extra crunch and a little bit more of that transient sound to cut through. Now in combination with everything, it starts to sound much better already, but we're not done yet. Because the biggest problem is that they still sound a little bit too separate overall. You now have to play around within those layers to make sure that you dial in the sweet spot of each one. So this one, for example, it sounds almost a little bit too high to me. So we'll see how this sounds if we just transpose it down a little bit. Easily go into the MIDI notes, select all of them and use Shift down. And then also see what is the cutoff point here. What do we want here? How much overlap do we want here with the other bass sounds? So use the EQ8 once again. And you can then go back to the mid layer and say, okay, let's see how this sounds if I take away a little bit here on the top. Do I want so much center information here or not? Because maybe there's a lead playing here later on. So you want to keep this clean and just have the top layer on the sides. This could be one solution, but this is where you also have to bring in your taste and what you want to achieve with the song, of course. Let's go back here. Go back to the sub layer, make sure that this is not sticking out too much. And eventually you'll land at the sweet spot of how these layers intersect. And take a little bit of time for that. This is trial and error. This is critical listening. It's super important. There's no like fixed frequency overlap that sounds best. You can then go into the unison settings of the bass mid layer and the bass top layer to make sure that they are exactly at the perfect width. So I feel that the mid layer is almost a bit too centered still. I can spread this out a bit more. And you can also play around with the number of voices. Sometimes less voices sounds better. And on the top layer, for example, let's try out different unison algorithms. Yeah, the shimmer almost sounds true retro now. I like the noise one quite a lot and the position spread. And then you just have to dial in the perfect volume. So let's see how much of this we want to bring in. I will just bring it down. Now, if you want a little bit more of that original mid-layer character in here and not just have the top dominated by the top bass, what you can do is you can switch this from a low-pass filter to a high-shelf filter and then bring down just a little bit of the top end. This to me sounds like the sweet spot. I have a little bit of that texture from the original mid bass in here, but it's still slightly more opened up by the top bass. Now it's time to group these bass layers together. And now we can work with this group and glue those tracks together a little bit. So let's first of all use the glue compressor. One of my favorite mixing tools in Ableton Live, I have to say. So we'll use a ratio 4:1, slower attack time, fast release time. It's really nice. It accentuates these transients of the bass a little bit, which I really like. If you want your kick to cut through even more, then you can decide to go for sidechain compression on the bass, chain through the kick drum signal. Or you can do what I do very often, which is just use the lazy LFO tool. And what it basically does is it creates an LFO that takes the bass down when the kick hits here and then brings it up once the kick has vanished. So this is more or less where those two signals overlap. So this also adds a little bit of nice movement. And by the way, I've made an entire kick and bass mixing video. If you're interested in that, check out this video. It's one of the best ones on the channel. I really stand behind this approach. It's going to help you quite a lot. Sometimes a little bit of saturation on the whole channel also makes sense. And by the way, the LFO tool takes down a little bit of gain. You can bring this up again with the saturator if you want. So I really like how this grooves now with the kick drum, since the LFO is quite extreme right now. You already get this kind of pumping feeling without being overwhelming. I would not combine this with also sidechain compression. This is going to get a little bit too much. Now this is a really important step. What you don't want to do is you don't want to flood your super mono low end now with a ton of reverb that makes it wide again and introduces, once again, phase problems. What you want to do is you want to create a reverb and only send the mid signal and the bass top signal into this. So I've created a reverb return track here. And by the way, I've made an entire video about reverbs, how to use them, which types of reverbs, what parameters to dial in. You can check it out here. In this case, I'm choosing a little bit denser reverb, something like a plate or a big hall or a cathedral sound, just because this immersive, lush, afterlife style techno calls for these big spaces. So I've chosen the modern dark plate because we want a plate sound that has not too many overtones. I've also used the dark hall as the algorithm for the rhythmic side of the reverb. The hybrid reverb is a combination between convolution and algorithmic reverb. Once again, my reverb video talks about this and the differences. Now, what I also wanted to do is to go obviously for 100% wet because we are on a return channel. So we can decide on the send side how much we want to send into this. There's no reason to keep part of the dry signal in here. And then you can use a little bit of the reverb to, for example, get rid of any super low end in here, but also reduce the amount of overtones, because if it sounds too, I would say, too edgy or too harsh, then this is because there are too many overtones in the reverb. Now, right now I have a lot of reverb in here. Let's just listen to how this sounds. Yeah, so this is probably a little bit too many overtones. You can also send a little bit of the top bass into this. And you can also spread out the reverb a little bit if you want to, because since we're not sending too much of the sub or bass frequencies into this and only use the mid and the top end, it's okay to boost this a little bit and to make it wider. Now, I will bring this reverb gradually in to the sweet spot. Also a little bit too long, so you can bring down the decay a bit. So the goal is to dial in the reverb just at the sweet spot where it helps support the feeling of depth a little bit without getting too obvious or too intrusive. Alright, now it's time to test how well we did this, and the only way to find out is to actually check the phase relationship between those channels. It sounds super wide, but is it actually? Let's take a closer look. So here's our stereo tool again, and if you remember correctly, in our amateur way of creating wide bass sounds that I showed you in the beginning, we were hovering around the 0 line here, which is not that great. It's still kind of at the edge of being okay because it's at least not negative. But let's see how this new bass patch performs where we combine those 3 channels together. The stereo tool is now on the bass group, so all of these 3 tracks together. Let's see. As you can see, we are in the positive region on the correlation meter, which means that this will play back perfectly in mono systems like clubs or festivals. And in case you want to find out what this type of workflow would look like with lead sounds, I have a slightly different approach there. Check out this video here and let me know in the comments now, what is your preferred way of creating white bass sounds? Do you have any follow-up questions? Make sure to leave a comment below and I will see you in the next video.